Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us all connect, inspire, and create. We cover different photography topics, and a guest speaker is here every Wednesday to share their expertise with us. A list of upcoming presentations can be found on my website at lindanickell.com. And under Happiness Hour, you'll find our previous sessions linked to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe, like, and share with some of your friends that might enjoy our content. Erin Randall is the lady that pushes all the buttons. Things running smoothly for us. So say hello, Erin.
Hello, Erin.
Our guest tonight is Rusty Myers, who is joining us from Austin, Texas. Rusty is a workshop instructor whose interest in wildlife led him into teaching classes at his local photography store on animal portraiture. In tonight's presentation, everything you need to know about bird photography. Just kidding, but it will be a good start. Rusty will cover his techniques for lighting, composition, and the camera settings that he uses to get sharp images for wildlife photography. Rusty, welcome to the Happiness Hour as a guest speaker. I know that you've been attending our sessions, and I think I need to offer some full disclosure by saying that you and I have actually shot together. And we met through a mutual friend, Scott Strands, who is another fantastic photographer, last year over Christmas. And so I knew you guys were going on your annual bird trip to Bosque del Apache. And it worked out that I was able to meet you guys, and you helped me get some great shots and kind of coached me from the front seat as we were rolling through this wildlife refuge. So I'm going to let you get started. And before you get to your presentation, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in teaching?
Yes, as Linda said, I'm Rusty Myers. I learned photography from my dad. And in fact, I have the camera he bought before I was born sitting on the shelf behind me. And I just learned to shoot whatever. As a teenager, he started a photography business. When I was a teenager, he started a photography business. And I learned to be a second shooter for him. And then honestly, I kind of let it go until we had kids. And all of a sudden I kind of went, hey, I ought to be taking pictures of the kids. But was a very slow adopter into digital. But one of the things I learned over the years is to kind of shoot what I just get drawn to shooting. But I always like to keep learning. And in fact, anything that I do, I tend to learn and share the information. I just sort of naturally tend to teach. And that's kind of how Scott and I met. He shoots people in sports. I shoot some sports and animals, and particularly birds. And so I started dragging him on these bird trips because that was something he'd never done. He taught me some of what I know about flash photography, and I continued with that. In fact, what Linda initially wanted me to teach on was using the flash when I'm shooting birds. I have not, that since she wasn't scheduling me till May, I was like, I've got time. I'll start working on this. So this presentation is one I've used as a more generic one. The class I've taught with this was one where we worked with a raptor rescue center, and they would bring in birds into a studio. And these are rehab birds that can't be released out into the wild. So they use them as education birds. And they're fairly calm. And we put them on perches for about 10 minutes, and everybody get a chance to do portrait photography of these raptors. So screech owls, great horned owls, peregrine falcons. So those are not great for developing skills, but whole lot of fun to shoot because they're birds you don't normally get to see that close. So that's kind of an intro of what we're doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about lighting. I'll mention some of the stuff I've done with flash as we go through. And if Linda reschedules me later, it will be all about
You're on the
lighting.
schedule. You're on the calendar.
Okay.
You just don't realize it yet because I came up with a date yesterday, and today was one of those crazy days of I need somebody. Can you do this? So
Okay.
that's what happened.
So I'm going to start. Right. Are we sharing?
You are sharing.
Okay. So, and I had to put that in the chat.
I'll do that for you.
Okay. And you can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook as Rusty Myers, but you know, Facebook is honestly such a goofy place. Instagram gets good pictures. And of course they're on my website, and there you get to zoom in, see them big. Keep moving. So we're going to run through some general bird photography. I'm going to talk, I'm going to call this the boring middle, but some camera settings just to kind of set the table so that when we get to talking about what makes a good image, how some of this makes sense. And then a little bit of troubleshooting, what could go wrong. So when you're shooting birds, you've pretty much got two types. The birds are sitting still or the birds are in flight. So anyway, still photographs. So there's birds that are perched, barely moving, and does make it a little easier to shoot them. But look for a story. What's the bird doing? So in this case, we've got a meadowlark that had just gotten breakfast. It was right after a morning rainstorm had rolled through in New Mexico. That's why it's all wet. And there's something going on here. And that's kind of what draws you into it instead of just a bird sitting there. It is easier to get a good focus when the bird's holding still, but with smaller birds, they will be active and moving around. So be ready. Yeah. Kind of pre-plan maybe a perch in the background. You notice there's nothing behind this one that's distracting. All right. And then the next one is birds in flight. A little more challenging, but honestly, a lot of fun. You kind of have to be aware and quick. Sometimes you have to keep your head on a swivel. In this case, this is a sandhill crane in New Mexico. The sun's starting to go down. That's why the wing is backlit. But it's a big, wide open area. And Scott was with me on this, and you know, we're almost spotting for each other. You know, you're getting a shot and you go, hey, there's some coming in from this side, and you're turning to look, and oh wait, they're coming from that side. But you try and figure out where they're coming from and generally where they're heading. In this case, we were trying to get them backlit by the sun. So we kind of had the shot planned. And so you're watching for them. And if they're not kind of following the scheme, you're waiting for the next bird to come in. You're going to shoot a little faster frame rate, but short bursts. You want to look for the wings. Well, we're talking about this more in composition. One of the options you can do is pan the camera to kind of show or emphasize the motion of the bird. It'll blur the background a little bit, and we'll see some examples of that later. Oops. Okay, and in this case, you know, I'm talking to photographers, so hopefully I can run through this pretty quick, but shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. Faster shutter speed stops action. Your aperture, your f-stop, is the size of the opening in the lens. It primarily is going to affect depth of field, but it also changes the amount of light that comes in. Your ISO is pretty much the amplification of the sensor data. A lot of you will think of it as how sensitive the sensor is, but your best data coming off the sensor is at the low native ISO. So if your default low is 100, you might have 50 ISO as an expanded range, but you're going to find that from a noise corruption of the data difference, there's a little difference there. But as you go to a higher ISO, it's trying to amplify the signal, and the noise that we see is actually corruption in the data. It's what happens is you boost a weak signal. It doesn't get better, it just gets stronger, right? So focus modes, primarily, you've got a single shot. So when you press your shutter button halfway in a single focus, it focuses and locks that focus, and it'll hold that as you shoot. Or a continuous focus, and each camera brand calls it something slightly different. But it will constantly focus, and you'll find, and I used to work this way, is I'd have some modes where I do a single shot, particularly with the bird sitting still, and then I go to the servo continuous mode for the moving birds. And I found that actually my camera is so good with the servo, I tend to leave it there. Now with the newer mirrorless cameras, you've got face tracking and eye tracking, eye focus, which is just a variation of the continuous, but it's just detecting stuff. And I can tell you that that can be fantastic and frustrating too. Metering modes. Your camera's probably got 4 or 5 different metering modes. But basically there's one that averages pretty much everything that your sensor sees. And the other one is a spot mode that is either located just on the center or it follows a focus point around. And we'll talk about that more later. And then there's custom settings. My 2 camera bodies, and I will admit I shoot Canon. So, but most cameras have 1, 2, or 3 custom modes you can add. And I set one up for birds that are sitting still, and it's kind of got a default shutter speed and f-stop and metering mode. And I've got another one for birds in flight, and it uses a different set of focus points and continuous focus and higher shutter speed as a default. And I'll real quickly switch between those depending on what I'm shooting. So I don't have to manually figure that out every time I switch from what type of shooting I'm doing. And then back button focus. A lot of action shooters like to do that. What it does is instead of your shutter button doing both triggering the focus and the shutter, it only does the shutter, and you use a button on the back of the camera to have it focus. There's some advantages to it. I don't do it. Somewhere along the way, I realized there was some reason, some way I shot that it didn't work for me, and I don't remember what that is. And I'm happy the way I am, so I'm not switching. Overexposed image means the image is bright or the subject's bright. The white areas are what we call blown out, but basically there's no detail left, and you can't recover that detail in post-processing. Underexposed, subject is, or the image overall is dark. Shadows are typically easier to recover in post-processing, but a highly underexposed image typically means as you bring up those dark areas, you'll see more digital noise in those dark areas. So an average metering mode will look at the whole light value of the picture you're taking and assume that it needs to average out to a neutral gray, 18% gray. So when you're, and we're going to get into some examples, but if you have a real white background and a dark subject, and you're in an average mode, it's going to see all that white, like a bright white sky or bright blue sky. And it's going to get priority and think your whole thing needs to be brighter, whereas your subject is darker and you really need to expose for the subject. And that's where spot metering mode is kind of nice, in that it meters just on the spot where that where your sensor meters. On Canon cameras, that's always in the middle, except for their high-end 1DX line. I know on at least some of the Nikons, it will follow your focus point. So if you're using one single focus point, the spot metering follows it, which is, to me, seems like the way to go. I'm not sure about Sony's or others. Okay. So this is my owl. He's highly trained to sit still. The settings here, the image on the left, and I've got the settings there so we can see kind of what changes. You'll notice both of these images are exposed similarly. They're meant to be the same, but the subject is about the same. The background's about the same. f2.8, they're both, all these shots will be at 42 millimeters. The one on the left is the normal, which means on Canon full auto. So I set nothing. It made all the decisions for that. That's a white sheet in the background. You notice it kind of went gray. And then the next shot, we've gone from, instead of a 40th of a second at 500 ISO, we're now at a 125th at 1250. And that's shutter priority. Basically, I set the shutter to be a 125th of a second. So it adjusted the ISO. And we got the same image. So we drop down to this next one, and on the left, we're aperture priority to where I'm setting the f-stop. Once again, I set it at f2.8. The camera's making more decisions, and it decides on a 40th of a second at ISO 400 for a similar exposure. Now, to me, the owl, the shadows in the owl are a little dark. So what I did is I dialed in a little exposure compensation, basically telling it to overexpose slightly. And you can see that in the aperture setting. I wish I could point it out for you, but it's +1 EV. And so now we're still at a 40th of a second f2.8, but the ISO is doubled. So that's where we gained our stop. And you can see the white's a little bit brighter. The sheet is getting a little wider in the background. On to the next slide. So on the left, we've still got that same overexposed one shot. On the right, we've gone full manual. And here I've just modified settings to end up in approximately the same area. So the exposure is the same on the owl. I have to admit I missed slightly, but what you're seeing is I'm using different modes, shutter priority, aperture priority, and full manual, and getting similar exposure, but different settings. Now we get into this one, and I'm sticking with full manual here for a little while. And I'm still using this average metering on the Canon. It's listing it as a pattern down here. So look at the owl and the difference between these two shots. The settings are exactly the same. What changed is the background went from white to a black background. The exposure on the owl stayed the same. And that's kind of what's important. You're out shooting birds in the field. And if your background's changing as it flies, but you've got the exposure dialed in for the bird that's flying, you don't need to change anything. Unless the sun goes behind the cloud, your exposure has to change to compensate for it. But the background, it doesn't change what the exposure is on your subject. And you're going to have to realize that as that background changes, it goes from skies to trees, your sky might get blown out if you're exposing correctly for the subject. And that happens. And so you spend a little time on compensation. So here I've gone with um, back to aperture priority, and I'm over and under exposing with a black sheet. This is similar to what I did with a gray sheet. And you can see how the exposure on the owl changes. All these were done with the average metering mode, the pattern. And then I repeated everything with a black background, a white background, and a gray background. And you can see I've gone to spot metering, aperture priority, and I just let it make all the rest of the decisions. And the owl's perfectly exposed because I was metering for the light on the owl, not the light on the background or the overall. All right. So that's the boring middle part of the presentation. So getting to settings. So with birds in flight, you're going to be in shutter priority or in manual. You're going to have a fast shutter speed, at least 1,000th of a second. In shutter priority, the aperture and the ISO, if you're letting it auto adjust, will both adjust. The camera's making those decisions for you. In full manual, you're making all the settings. I will admit that typically when I'm in manual, I'm letting it go with auto ISO, so the camera is still making some decisions. And I may dial in some exposure compensation. But if I do get to the point where I'm very, very comfortable with the lighting, I will go to a manual ISO, so a full manual mode. I typically will use on my new camera the face or eye detect, but otherwise I'm using a single focus point or small group of focus points. So if the bird is flying across from left to right, I typically will move those points a little to the right-hand side of the screen, so that I'm focusing on the head of the bird as it's coming across, and the back end of the body isn't cut off the frame, or I have to zoom out wider to let it fill. For still birds, typically I'm doing aperture priority or manual, but what I'm doing is I'm concentrating on what depth of field I want, so that my composition looks good. Sometimes you've got telephone poles or something in the background, or a fence or a building, and you just want to fuzz that out a little bit. So I'll open it up and run a wider f-stop. Now, if you're using a long lens when you're doing this, like a 400 millimeter lens, you do want to watch your shutter speed. And this comes into really knowing your camera, just how well, if the lens is stabilized, if the body of the camera is stabilized. But the general rule of thumb is 400 millimeter lens, you don't want to go less than a 400th of a second, unless you're really comfortable with the stabilization. And that works fine with birds that are still. When shutter speed, you're stopping action with the birds in flight. So panning shots can be kind of fun. And that's all going to be focused on the shutter speed. So either shutter priority or manual. I like to start at about a 250th of a second. Bigger birds, sandhill cranes, pelicans are awesome to learn tracking, to do panning shots. Because what you want to do is you want to get that focus point on their head and hold it there as the shot happens. And then the background will blur, show motion blur, not just be fuzzy from the f-stop, but it'll show motion blur, which is a neat effect. And then I kind of covered this when I was talking about exposure. So bright skies mean you've got to, and it seems counterintuitive, but you need to raise the exposure some, because the subject's going to be backlit and it'll just be a silhouette if you don't raise your exposure. And in general, white birds, you tend to get overexposed, particularly in the average metering mode. So you have to dial in some underexposure, either in manual mode, you go half stop, 2/3 a full stop under to compensate. Dark birds are kind of the opposite. They're just looking like black blobs. Same with dark dogs, white dogs. This carries over into all sorts of critters. Um, so, Linda, did any questions pop up yet?
There was one question, and maybe you answered it, and maybe I wasn't following it. But David Wilson was asking, can you explain average metering? I think you.
Yeah, I kind of mentioned that, but um, so of the 4 metering modes on my Canon, one is spot, which is very specific, and the rest are kind of variations of average, but one is kind of their smart averaging, and so it will attempt to take into account something about the subjects. Um, One of the great or interesting things to do is take your camera, put a go to a white wall that's evenly lit, um, and shoot a picture of that, and in average metering, and it will come out very gray, because the camera wants to average it out. It wants the average of all the light value in there to be medium gray. Um, and so then you can dial in some exposure compensation to brighten it up, and probably a stop and a half. And it's good to kind of know what your camera does and test that out. And then you can go the other way and you can turn it black. And then when we get to talking about flash next time I talk, you can do the with flash placement and power and some of the settings in the camera, you can also control what happens in the background. But that's a whole nother bit of magic. Um, so where to find birds? Um, so local Audubon Society, they have bird walks. There's people that'll talk to you till your ears fall off about local hotspots. Word of mouth sort of things. Just standing around talking with somebody, they told me about a place in Taylor, Texas, which is 25 minutes from here. It turns out there's this little island in this park next to the baseball field where herons and egrets roost every year. I've got some great pictures there. Um, I would never have thought that they'd be roosting on this little island. 50, 60 of them. Hornsby Bend in Austin. It's near the airport, right on the Colorado River. It is a water treatment facility, but they're doing some fancy stuff where they're creating artificial wetlands, and they get a lot of migratory birds. And it is open for bird watchers to come in. You come into the facility, say, I want to go look at the birds, and they check you in and off you go, and you can wander around. They've got bird watching stations set up. So finding out if there's places like that. Of course, state parks, national parks, wildlife refuges are always great. There are phone apps. eBird has location information. I use the Audubon app for some identification. The Merlin Bird ID is fantastic if you've got a picture onto your phone. It will look at the picture and do the identification for you. iNaturalist is very similar. The iNaturalist app will also identify plants and animals and mushrooms, insects. And then bird calls and bait. And this, I'm also going to throw in here a little discussion of flash. And I'd say it depends. So in my backyard, I have a bird feeder at one end. At the other end, I have a screech owl house. And when the cardinals are flying around in the spring, they get really busy making a lot of noise. I will occasionally pull out the Audubon app. It's got sounds, and I'll just make a little cardinal sound, and they'll pop out on the branches near me, and I get some very nice shots of them. It's a very controlled situation. I am not throwing those birds off their normal routine. They're still hanging around my yard. But out in the wild, um, using calls, putting out bait, to me, you're changing their behavior, drawing them away from what they were normally doing. Um, and so I don't do that. Um, and uh, Flash photography, I mentioned screech owl. No, I don't go set up a flash and flash my screech owl in the dark. Um, that's that's not good for them. But I will use a big softbox with a flash down on a perch near my bird feeder with the flash power very low. And what it does is it gives me a little bit of fill light and it stops the action of the bird. I've used it around hummingbird feeders. Um, and it's a good way to stop the wing action on a hummingbird. But it's very low, quick power. It's not even that, sometimes you don't even realize it went off. It's so low. Okay. All right. So composition. This is where things get a little more fun and we get to see some pictures. So when you get somewhere and you see a bunch of birds, sometimes you just got to get a picture. Um, and it's hard to think, oh, well, then, let's hold off and find the perfect picture. Sometimes it's a bird you've never seen. You want to get that bird for your life list. So get the shot, get it out of your system. Then try and get a better one. Look at what you got. How do you get it better? Backgrounds, and I gotta, you notice I really emphasize this here. Backgrounds are huge in the final result of an image. A pole through the bird, a twig right behind it, a leaf hanging over part of it, flying past a house as you're shooting it, or something like that. It you might have done everything else perfect, but that background you look at it and go, oh, so close. And then cropping versus framing. The way I think of it is, framing is when you're taking the original shot, where the image is on the camera sensor. Is it all the way on there mainly? And then cropping is kind of how you fix it in post processing. So if you couldn't get close enough, you might crop in to get rid of the blank space or the less useful space around the image. Uh, or if the image was way over in the corner, you might crop to get rid of the extra stuff. Birds, you really want to see the head and the eyes. The eyes are really important, particularly if you've got the light hitting the eyes, so you get a little catch light in it. It gives the eyes a little twinkle. Shots going away, getting shots of the bird butts typically is not interesting. So you want to look for the birds coming towards you or crossing in front of you. So if they're flying, look where the sun is, look where they're coming from, position yourself so you've got the best light on the bird and the best angle for them. All right. And I've mentioned this already. Sometimes you're going to have a bright background, but the subject is the bird first. If it's too distracting as far as how white it is, you need to move and try and set it up so you don't have that bright background, but it's going to happen. Okay, so here's a poor framing image. Some snow geese coming in. I've chopped off the wing. And on top of that, the wing positions of the birds really aren't that attractive. I've got one that's what we call pancake mode. It's all flat. The other two, the wings are down. Spacing on the birds is not even. So here I've got all three of them in the frame, but those two birds are kind of overlapping and they're looking like they're going to run into each other. And then here, and you realize that these are the same three birds. I'm just following them, shooting bursts as they go. So now I finally got them all in the frame. They're evenly spaced, and I've got this nice progression of wing angles. Even though the last one's kind of in the pancake, I've got that nice progression. So it improves with each shot. Okay. And think about the wing position. Some birds look better with the wings down. Some you like to see that underbelly and what's underneath on the bottom of the wing, because you get a nice pattern from it. But think about it. In both of these cases, this is far more interesting than the pancake mode when they're just flat out, where you can't see any detail on there. The bird on the left, you can see a little of the top and underlid a little bit. In fact, I like that picture better than the two sandhills on the right. But another composition example, the upper left, single bird in a marshy area. It's a picture of a sandhill crane. I kind of improved it by getting the little family unit right below it. But the last picture, now I've got sunset, I've got bird reflection, I've got the family unit, I've got a little more color. The other two are kind of washed out. This one, I've got that nice warm tone in the background, a little reflected off the birds. And it's just a much more interesting picture. And this is a sequence of a bald eagle. And in fact, the sequence, is pretty obvious. He was on the perch, then he took off, and then the upper left was a little further along. But which one is more interesting? I don't think the one in the upper left is very interesting. I mean, it shows his wings and he's flying and stuff, but the catching him as it took off was neat, and that launch away. But I think the picture on the upper right is probably the most intriguing, because it gives you the sense of something's happening. All right. Here's one where the landscape's kind of neat. But, the birds are a little chaotic. They're overlapping each other. The wings are all over the place. They're not in any sort of synchronized flapping. So the solution was just to find a smaller group, just wait for another group to come by, got in a little tighter, got 3 birds that happen to be spaced out, and their wings are doing something different, but almost in sequence. Yeah, the last bird's got the pancake, but it's a sequence. You can see the action as they're coming into land. Here's a great egret in that park I was talking about, with the island, and this was in the spring. You can see with the green around the eyes that he's got the breeding colors going on. The extra feathers there on the wings are really lively and stuff like that. He's kind of sitting on a nest here, or starting to build one. But this is a little more interesting. And I sat there and waited until that particular bird did that, because he was the one that I had the best angle on, and I liked the way the grass is tufted up, and he just is putting on a show there. Sat there 5 or 10 minutes. I probably took 100 shots. Not necessarily every single one of them, but I was waiting for this to happen. Here's another one, a cedar waxwing. This is my backyard. Got a berry. It's kind of a neat shot. This is the next shot in that sequence. That's what happens when you shoot a nice little burst. Sometimes you get something. This is all it is his beak's open and the berry's in the air now, but it's action. Actually, the next picture's in that burst. I've also got one where he's got a big bulge in his neck where he swallowed it. This is from the class I taught. So here's a red-tailed hawk, and we've got some nice, very even lighting. Picture on the left, it's a hawk. Somebody's hand. It's a stump he's sitting on. The next picture, and they're all in focus. Next picture, he's looking at something else. Then I put on the long zoom lens, and I got in, and so this is essentially uncropped at 400 millimeter. And I'm doing a portrait right in on his eye. And you can see a little catch light in his eye from the overhead light. Okay. Quick pause. Any questions come in?
Nope. Nope. We're
Okay.
good.
It means I'm either doing an excellent job or I'm boring everybody. So I choose the former. Um,
Yeah.
so blurring. So blur can be good, like when we're trying to do a panning shot and you're intentionally blurring the background, or you're doing a wide open f-stop and you want to blur the background, but you want your subject generally to be sharp. And in fact, if you want it blurry after the fact, you can do that in post-processing, but it's very hard to make them sharp. I'm not. There's some nice software that does that, but it's better to start sharp. Get it right in the camera, right? So focus on the eyes. When we look at images, one of the first things we tend to look at are the eyes. Um, and then motion blur happens in different ways. Some ways, sometimes it happens when the subject moves when we're not ready. Plus the shutter speed's a little slow. Motion blur can also happen when we move the camera when we didn't mean to. We don't have a good stable platform, meaning we're not using a tripod, or we don't have our elbows tucked in. I mean, when we're holding the camera, I don't know if anybody could see the speaker view, but I've got my hands in tight to my chest. So I'm getting as stable as I can. I've got my feet about shoulder width apart, slightly angled towards the subject. Um, and then sometimes you miss focus when the camera locks on something you didn't want. And that's one of the things I found with my face and eye detect, that when it doesn't pick up the face or the head or the eye, it does a little searching, and sometimes it's hard to get it back onto my subject so it can find that eye. That's something I'm still learning. Um, Thermal distortion. We've all seen the mirages when we're driving down the road in the summer and you see the heat waves coming up. That happens in the field on a cold day. But as soon as that sun starts hitting that field, heat comes up, and you might think you're sitting there with your 600 millimeter lens and you're going to get the picture of that elk, 400 yards away. If it's not still 6 or 7 in the morning, you're probably getting heat off that field, and you're going to look at that picture and you're going, this lens is horrible. It never gets me good shots. That's going to be a constant problem over long distances. So morning and evening, after the sun's not directly heating things up, you'll do much better. Of course, with the panning shot, you're expecting blurred background. And I will do some of the birds in flight, particularly the birds with big wings. When they're doing the big flap, you might be shooting at a shutter speed that's sharp enough to stop all the action at the face, the eyes, the shoulders of the bird, but that wingtip will still be moving. I actually like that because it shows motion. When you totally freeze it, it's almost like it was frozen in time. I like to see that it's going somewhere. Okay, so here's one. Subject moved before he was sitting on a branch. I was bringing the camera up, and it took off. Semi got it in focus. It's kind of far away, but the bird took off on me. And you're probably asking, as we go through these pictures, why did he save these pictures? I'm going to tell you, I saved them just for this sort of class. And I have no others. Honest, no. Of course, that's not true. I've got horrible pictures that I should be deleting. But here's one where I'm trying to get this bird flying away, and it locked in on the branch. Nice tree picture. And so that happens. Here's one, and unfortunately, I think in Zoom, it's not going to show well. But this is about 200 yards out across the field, about 11:30 in the morning. It was about 20 degrees that morning, and so by this time, it's about 40 degrees. And it was starting to feel warm to us at that point. But I could just look out there and I could see the shimmering, and I knew it wasn't going to be a sharp shot. I don't know why I took it, but I did. Um, I once heard Joe McNally say something. He's a famous photographer. Um, he says, I never underestimate my ability to take a bad shot. Um, and if you're waiting to always take the good shot, you're going to miss some shots. So here's one where I needed a little more shutter speed. I got the face of this bird as it took off, but he is flapping hard to get some altitude, and I needed to be shooting faster. It is kind of neat showing the wings in motion, but in my opinion, a little too much. So here's a panning shot of a brown pelican, and you can see he's fairly sharp across there, mainly across the body and the eyes. This was shot at 200th of a second as he flew by, and you can see the water looks blurred because I'm tracking with the bird. So that was intentional. This is considered decent. Unfortunately, the bird's flying away from me. I'd rather have him turn towards me a little more. Okay, so all these things are kind of strong suggestions, right? Figure it out, learn to do it right, and then get creative. Figure out which one of these doesn't work for you or you like to tweak. It's a starting point. Luck matters. Being prepared helps. Knowing your camera and the settings and being able to change them quickly to get the desired result is important. Getting backlit shots at sunrise and sunset can be neat. Silhouettes are fine. You don't have to have the bird perfectly in focus. So here's where luck helps. Just driving down the road, heron pops up out of a ditch with a bullfrog stuck in its mouth. Scott was with me. We both got shot. Yeah, and it's nature, it's action, it's something happened. I would have never expected this to happen, but cameras were on and ready. I mentioned earlier, bird butts aren't necessarily interesting, but synchronized swimming ducks, now that's something. So sometimes it can be interesting. And then here's some sandhill cranes at sunset. And that was exactly the effect I was going for. And that's it.
I don't see any questions for you, Rusty. So you either covered everything perfectly. I want to just throw out there too. I was in the car with you guys when the bullfrog happened, and luck does count because I was not lucky. I did not get any shots of that bird or the bullfrog, and I sat and was cranky in the back seat for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Scott and I, the first year we were out at that place, we
this was in Bosque del Apache, by the way.
Oh yeah, sorry. Scott's a deer hunter, and I'm looking for birds. He says, "How do you keep seeing these birds?" And I'm like, "Well, I got a mental shape in my head of what a raptor looks like, and that's what I'm looking for. I see those bobs in the tree, and it's like that." And so we're driving along. He says, "Hey, there's a buck down the road." And I'm like, "Where?" And he says, "Oh, about 100 yards down there." And so we start easing along, and it decides to go through a ditch to our left, and the water was deep. He had to swim it, and we both hopped out and got shots of this buck come up out of the ditch, get to land and shake like a dog, water spraying all over, and it turned and looked at us and then took off. But I would have never seen the deer early enough if Scott wasn't there, because his eyes were kind of geared into that. So learning about your subject, I think, is important. What their behavior is. little songbirds, how they fly around, how they return to roosts. What does a raptor do when it's hunting? Uh, when you're looking for harriers, they're like constant motion, there and gone. Red-tailed hawk, you're fine sitting in a tree waiting for something to happen. You got to know.
So there is one question that popped in, and it's
Mhm.
about the bullfrog shot that I do not have. But so David is asking, there was an area between the frog and the bird that was slightly blurred. Was that an effect? Was this effect intentional?
Let me go back to that. Um, that was actually some of the grass that was close to me.
Mhm.
Um, that was probably shot at 300 or 400 millimeters on a zoom lens. He'd just come up out of a ditch and landed in some grass. Remember, right at the beginning, I said something about sometimes you just want to get the shot. I wanted to get something before he was gone. Um, and so I did get about 10 shots, not all of them in a burst. I was able to move slightly. Um, but he was also turning and shifting, and the frog wasn't as obvious in some of the other ones. So anyway, yes, that is blurred foreground. I wish it wasn't there on top of the frog.
But you got the shot. I would take that shot just to have the shot. Okay, so thank you, Rusty, for doing this, especially since this was such a last minute invitation. You guys can find Rusty at sammyersphoto.com. And if you're on Instagram, be sure to give him a follow at Rusty Myers Photo, and that's Myers, Myers photo. I'll be sure to put that into the show notes. Our scheduled guest, Rob Huvis, is in South Florida, and Tropical Storm Etta is creating a very stressful situation for his family tonight. But as soon as I can, I'll reschedule Rob. And his presentation was on lightning and time lapse, and I'll get it back here. So next week, Valerie Hoffman, she'll be here. She's going to be here to inspire us in her presentation called Finding Beauty in the Broken. And until next Wednesday, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you next week.